that led to like police marshaling at where the football field is for U of H. They got like hundreds of police armed that marched onto the TSU campus and fired hundreds of bullets into a dormitory. And the one cop was shot and killed, and they were alleging that these 5 students had done it. But he was shot with a rifle bullet that was only the police had. So the cop was shot and killed by like a ricochet from the police, but so
friendly fire.
Yeah, so this was happening immediately after this struggle had happened, and that's a whole other. They ended up moving the trial of one of the guys to Victoria, Texas, because they didn't think they could have a fair trial in Houston, so they moved to Victoria, which is like an even more racist place than Houston. But the long story short of the Able struggle was it was one of the first African American studies departments in the country, let alone in the South, and it still exists. And
Rob,
it set the
when
stage.
did they name the park after them? Isn't it formerly then using park there now?
There is a
when did they,
park.
You remember when they did that?
No. You should know. What's that now? But yeah, so there's now a park named after her, and she was sadly murdered in very suspicious
and I guess that's why
circumstances.
they named the park after her.
And yeah, and then what Gene Locke worked at, I think he worked at Shell Refinery, and
it may have been one of the ones.
And then he ran for mayor with a campaign platform about having more police on the streets and stuff. So times change. But did we cover everything?
No.
The big. I don't know if you have any more stories. The gentrification discussion, we could have a long discussion. I don't know what history.
Yeah, I'm not qualified to talk about gentrification so much because there's the Allen Parkway Village thing. I was part of that. I'm more interested in just kind of reconnecting along the line that we were talking about, updating kind of some stuff, touch on some of the stuff that John was talking about. John Brown, we mentioned that there was 2 John Brown groups, the revolutionary group that was happening more in the early 70s, and then I was just a kid. In the late 70s, early 80s, there was the John Brown Anti-Klan Committee, which was different than the revolutionary group. And so that's when I started to get involved. I was around 18. And, but to connect it to this stuff that John was talking about, there was a group of radical folks in the 60s, the Weathermen, the Weather Underground, and they were doing some small bombings here and there to protest the Vietnam War. And like a lot of revolutionary groups, they have their underground faction, and then they have a support group that's out in the open, and an above ground faction that's not in arms or bombing things. And so, but the FBI is after them too, because they're basically supporting and advocating for the Weathermen. Okay? And so, as the FBI does their thing and infiltrates groups and disrupts and arrests people and causes chaos, the left reacts by forming new groups, that are not connected with the old baggage, things that can continue to do the work above ground, advocating for revolutionary stuff and anti-war stuff. And one of those groups that was some evolution down the line, of many steps from the Weathermen, was called Prairie Fire. And still, again, this is all before my time, so I can't speak about Prairie Fire. But I believe they had a bookstore in Pasadena, right? Was it Pasadena?
It was like Elgin.
Yeah,
I
think you're right up to that point. And again, to point out Rob's point, I think you have to look at all of this stuff happening with a national perspective, because it wasn't just isolated stuff going on here. Again, some of these factions that tended to develop after SDS, predominantly the ones that I was associated with, would be the Red 2 faction, and then folks that came out of what was the Workers' Student Alliance, the Progressive Labor Party faction of SDS, came together to form like the October League.
Well, I want to focus on the bookstore shooting.
That's where we're
Because
going.
that's going to relate
Yeah, well,
to the John Brown anti-Klan committee.
And that's
Can you speak
where
about the shooting?
Yeah, well, that's where how this bookstore developed. That out of this group, there were a couple of people that were in that organization with substantial bank accounts, family money, and that money is what opened up Prairie Fire Bookstore on Main and Elgin. Rob was right. That became a Maoist bookstore. It was run like a bookstore. It had a nice budget. It had enough to pay someone. But again,
They have political meetings there, just like this.
yes, the bookstore was in front, and then there was an open space in the back. But imagine on Main Street, shop windows, and right next to maybe a boutique was this communist bookstore that was hosting events. And so it became a real target. And again, kind of tying into Klan stuff, that was a big concern, and the only option was armed self-defense. So naturally, there were a lot of folks around the left, a lot of good Marx people, men and women, that knew guns, knew how to handle the guns, and were pretty good shots. And that everywhere there was an event, there was always armed defense available. So that bookstore always had, you'd walk in and where maybe Adam would be sitting, there was a loaded shotgun behind him and a pistol underneath the counter. And so it was kind of all this stuff going on at the bookstore. It was an activity center. And then, do you know the...
Yeah, we got a little color commentary,
Yeah.
because this is the Walter Birdwell story. And Yolanda, his wife, she was, just a little background, she was an anti-war activist in the 60s. She was of Mexican origin, lived in Houston, very much a leader in the anti-war struggle in Houston in the 60s. She's in the history books, the 500 years of, Mexican history, I think it's called. Her photo's in that, isn't it? Anyway, Walter was an intelligence guy in the military, undercover, to infiltrate the anti-war groups, and then after basically living and working with these anti-war groups as an infiltrator, he decided that they were right and the U.S. military was wrong. When he fell in love with Yolanda. They got married. They've had a long life together. As soon as he got out of the military, keeps working with these radical groups, and becomes very left wing. But because he's a military guy, he's very crack shot with a pistol. I can hit anything at any distance, marksman. And he became a postman and started hanging out together at this Prairie Fire Bookstore. And so one day the Klan comes by. They have their big office in Pasadena, and they drive by. They do a drive-by, and they shoot up the bookstore in the windows. And everybody's like, "Oh no, this is bad." And Walter's like, "Well, okay, I've got a gun." Next time the Klan comes by, he steps out on the sidewalk and he just, puts many holes in their car as they drive off, and they never come back. And so I became really good friends with Walter later on. They're just great people. And they're here with us now, but they're kind of older and retired now, moved somewhere else. But anyway, the Prairie Fire organization was one of these things that was...
Let me back up. And what's good about the left being able to document stuff is because as we get older, our memory starts to fade, and you don't quite... And I find that, I had a very long discussion with an old comrade last night, and, he would, "Oh, yeah, I forgot about that." Or I would say, "What was that person's name?" Or "Who was it?" "Oh, yeah," And I think that over the years, my understanding of that day, and having been around the bookstore, was that there was police complicity in the attack on the bookstore. That block of Main Street was essentially blocked off by the police. Maybe not overtly, but there was a cop car here, there was a cop car. That street became, and there was an event that day. There was I forgot which one, what the occasion was, but there were about 20 people in the bookstore that day. And my understanding was that, and I was a study group that, that they did stop, but that a brick was thrown through the window, and they had gotten out of the car and were getting ready to rush the bookstore. And that's when Walter went for the gun and shot one of them. And it was charges that were brought against Walter. I don't remember which ones. He eventually got off, and the cops interviewed this Klansman that he ended up shooting. He said, "No, we're not going to push it because we'll take care of it. We're going to handle the retribution." And for weeks after that event, you know, we took turns camping out in Walter and Yolanda's driveway as kind of a security force until this thing blew over, which it eventually did. But, you know, it wasn't just the bookstore that came under attack. I mean, that was the time when the Pacifica station was knocked off the air.
Transmitter was blown up twice by the Klan.
Ben Levy, a Houston socialist attorney's house was shot at. The Shacks, a very prominent anti-war left commie family on West Main, and the son still lives there today, was shotgunned. And so that's what was happening in Houston at the time, at that particular time, that it was very important to be able to defend your ground against these armed Klan attacks.
Okay, so now I'm going to bring it up to 1983.
Yeah, there you go.
We start off with the Weather Underground in the late 60s, several organizations. After that is the Prairie Fire organization, a national organization. They have their bookstore on Main and Elgin. Several organizations after that. These things just keep evolving. People, a lot of the same people are connected through this whole timeline. And the FBI is trying to keep up, like, okay, who are, they're trying to follow these people that were connected to this original bombings in the 60s from the Weathermen. So they're following these groups all the way up to John Brown Anti-Klan Committee in around 1982, 1983, when I started to get involved with them. I was probably 22 or so at that point. And I had no idea about the radical history of this organization. I was young, and it's just like, wow, the Klan, they suck, And so you're organizing against the Klan, cool, how do I help? And so I was just a grunt. And but I think the weirdest thing about John Brown Anti-Klan Committee is that they saw themselves as white revolutionaries that were in the struggle to support very radical African American groups that were actually separatist. They wanted to take 5 states away from the United States in the South and become an African American separate country. And it's like, I'm like, what? It's like, didn't make much sense to me then, but they were the cutting edge group fighting the Klan. And so I hung out with them. And there was a couple of big protests, big demos, the Klan was on a recruiting drive. And they do this like every 10 or 20 years because Klansmen get old, they fade out, the group wants to, get fresh blood, so they go on a recruiting drive. So 82, 83, they are on one of these recruiting drives trying to do a lot of marches and rallies to gather new people, young folks that have their same sort of ideas. And this is all before, the skinhead thing got big. And so it was a big demo in Austin. A lot of folks showed up for it. The Brown Berets, Black Panthers. John Brown organized a lot of people to come to that. And the Austin cops weren't ready for it. And it turned into the Brown Berets got their heads beat in. A woman in the Brown Berets, the cops, along the march, beat some, just ganged up on this woman. They pulled her out, just, cracked her skull. And but then later on, as it moved to the Klan moved up into the Capitol, At that point, the capital of Texas, the field around, going from the sidewalk around the street up to the steps where the Klan was filled with rocks. It was a field of rocks. And the Klan walked up this sidewalk, surrounded on the other side by cops trying to protect them. And then on either side of that, hundreds or thousands of protesters. And it became this, like, gauntlet of, a firing squad. People throwing rocks, some of them hitting the Klan, some, protesters throwing rocks, missing the Klansmen, and hitting other anti-Klan protesters on the other side. And so it was kind of comical. It wound up with the Klan quickly moving to their cars in this little parking lot right next to the Capitol, which was, because it's so hilly in Austin, this parking lot was below, it was like an underground parking lot without a roof, and you could surround this rail around this parking lot and look down on all the Klan cars, about 20 of them, and you're like one story above them, surrounded with rocks everywhere, just ready for action. And you could, reach down and pick up a rock and throw it at the Klan as they're getting in their cars, and they're down in this pit, and it was like an amazing thing. And the HPD at that point and the Houston and the Austin cops had not been integrated at that point yet. They were still, for the most part, all white police forces, a smattering of African Americans and officers, but not, out on patrol. And then some Hispanic officers, but largely a white police force, not integrated. But the Texas state troopers had already integrated. As soon as the Klan left the sidewalk and got onto the state capitol steps, they immediately, the Austin cops, that's not their territory anymore. Now it's the state troopers. State troopers had been integrated. I remember seeing some African American troopers out there, real tall dudes, cowboy boots, the famous star, cowboy hat, and African American. Okay, and I remember seeing this one guy telling people, now you put that rock down, just smiling, just to make, put that rock down, And so it just continued. The Texas State Troopers really didn't do anything to stop this massacre of the KKK. And anyway, I don't think anybody went to the hospital, but a bunch of windows got smashed. I'm sure there was a lot of bruises. So 2 months later, there's a Klan demo in Houston. All right, John Brown Anti-Klan Committee is organizing like busloads of African American church people from Louisiana. Because this really got a lot of attention, this thing in Austin, and so people are coming to stop the Klan in Houston. They're coming from everywhere. It wound up being like 10,000 people showing up to oppose the Klan in Houston. Well, the cops had known about this. They were trying to, they did all kind of intel from the low-level Klan cops, then above, that's the bottom feeders of the police department in Houston. And then you had, at the top of the police department, you had the Criminal Intelligence Division, which were, a little bit smarter, a little bit older cops. And then they were the connection to the FBI, who was, their interest in it, the FBI, was to go after these radical folks that were connected to the Weather Underground from 20 years earlier, okay? The bottom feeder Klan cops were just like, wanted to be there to protect their Klan brothers, right? And then you've got the CID, who's like in charge of basically doing a lot of the infiltration, going undercover, trying to infiltrate the anti-Klan activities leading up to these marches. I happened to volunteer to organize an anti-Klan John Brown benefit, at a punk rock club called the Island, Paradise Island. I wrote a story about it, and haven't published it yet. But it was a great night of, wonderful punk rock stuff. All these bands like Really Red, who did songs about police murders, and it was great stuff. Anyway, there was always new people coming into our scene from Austin, so we didn't really think twice when we saw some new folks show up that were dressed kind of funny. But it turns out we were infiltrated by the Criminal Intelligence Division, basically the FBI cops. Okay, dressed up like pimps and whores. So it's like they couldn't figure out what a punk rocker looked like, so they dressed up like pimps and whores. It's like weird, you know. And prostitutes, I should say. And so they're in here about 1:45 inside this club. All of a sudden, these guys start pulling out their guns and waving them around, and you know, we thought we were getting robbed or something. And but it turns out it was these cops. And they, you know, turn the lights on, and they bust the place. A dozen cop cars show up, and they're just pulling people, you know, just loading their car up. Just try to, because this is like 2 days before the anti-Klan march, right? And they're trying to get intel. They spent all night long, you know, trying to figure out who's who, who's the organizers. And it was good that, you know, the real organizers of John Brown didn't show up that night, but the cops already knew who they were. And, but they filled up like 12 police cars, took them away, and people arrested for just nothing. And then all let out, you know, charges dropped later, but they just, you know, kind of like, it's just harassment, right? So the Klan march happens. 2 days later. The HPD winds up calling out all the king's horses and all the king's men, like no time off for anybody. I mean, they had all the dogs, all the horses, every cop, everybody was on shift. And then that wasn't enough. They had to call in police forces from around the city of Houston. You saw like 5 different kinds of uniforms out there. They had Bel Air cops and Friendswoods and Galveston, you know, all those Klan brothers. Who knows, half of them probably showed up just to volunteer because they were fucking Klansmen. And who knows how much were actually contracted and hired to do the extra security. But they wanted to prevent what happened 2 months earlier in Austin, and they wanted to prevent what happened like 5 years earlier at Moody Park, which is a riot about a Klan murder, you know, Jose Campos Torres. And so they're paranoid, they overreact, and it cost the city, like who knows how much, probably over $1 million, and you know, that money back then is probably be $5 million now. So they arrested John Brown leadership folks as they're just walking on the sidewalk, going to the demo, put them in a big van, and just hold them there. And I didn't get arrested. They didn't think much of me. So this thing happens. The Klan has their rally. They were protected by all these cops. They didn't get, stoned or anything. And so to them it was successful. The Klan had a successful rally. The John Brown people were thinking, oh, fuck, man, they got away with it. You know, the cops and the Klan, they just run this shit. We're a failure, you know. A lot of these outside organizers for John Brown, people that had come here from New England to basically organize this anti-Klan stuff, just, tucked their tails and ran because they were afraid that several levels of the police and the FBI and the Ku Klux Klan were going to be out to kill them. And they were afraid, and they left. They went on and had their lives somewhere else, all thinking all this time that, they were a complete failure. But as it turns out, we call that a Pyrrhic victory, okay? A couple of months after the thing in downtown Houston, at City Hall, the city council thinks, geez, that cost us a lot of money. How are we going to pay for this? All this money to pay for all these cops. It's like, we need to update the parade codes. Because it's like just an economic thing. You got to pay for this. And so they updated the parade permit codes, city laws, and every group has to pay for their own insurance and security after that. And that's not very expensive for most groups that want to have a parade downtown. But for the Ku Klux Klan, it's $1 million. The other big cities in Texas adopted the same law. They didn't publicize it because it's really, you could make a case that it's unconstitutional to do that. But it's the effect that we wanted, which was that it has prevented the KKK from marching in any of the big cities in Texas, for the most part, since 1983. And so, it wasn't publicized. The city of Houston didn't want the people to even know about it, but it has had that effect. And so it's a good thing. So basically, John Brown won, the Klan lost, and nobody knows about it. But you notice that there isn't many Klan marches here. They happen in little towns, you know, Fresno, Conroe, or wherever it is. You know, little towns all over the place. They get a little bit of opposition, but they don't march in the big cities anymore.
All right, y'all. It's been an hour of us telling stories. Anybody else have stories? Or are y'all storied out? Round two of stories?
Comments, questions, concerns?
So the Klan is still pretty powerful locally here, do you think?
Carlos Calvillo was telling me yesterday, Carlos, I want to tell you about who he is, because he's an old character. He did a film about Jose Campos Torres. Please grab a flyer. Please come to TSU next Wednesday at 1 o'clock to see Carlos's film that he did about Jose Campos Torres, this police murder in 1978, which led to the Moody Park riot. And anyway, I was doing research, talking to Carlos, about a year ago for the story I wrote about John Brown and Jose Campos Torres and the punk rock scene. And Carlos was like, "Oh man, the Klan, they're not active anymore. Don't do it. You're wasting your time. Nobody cares about them anymore." And I gave Carlos a ride yesterday after this Moody Park event we were at, and he was telling me, "Oh yeah, I'm going to Pasadena. I think Monday, a week from Monday or something, because they're burning crosses on this black woman's front lawn. The Pasadena Klan. They're active again. So now they're popping their head up again. It's just like mushrooms. They go down for a while, but there's you don't see them, but every once in a while they pop up again. And now Carlos is like, yeah, they're back. They're back. And so they're harassing this African American woman. She's living in some part of Pasadena that's a real Klan area and a more white kind of neighborhood. And so I think Carlos, you mentioned Juan Alex and some other folks and somebody else, they're meeting out there to support this woman at some point and confront the Klan. And, I'm not sure when that is, but they're still around. A lot of the youngsters have moved on into other kind of groups, the skinhead kind of stuff. But just as a postscript, when we were doing this stuff in 1983, the FBI was working with the local cops, who were the Klan, against us, okay? But around that time, the FBI started to infiltrate these Klan groups and long range, like undercover groups, like undercover agent for 5 years living undercover with the Klan, working with them, to infiltrate them, to stop them. And ultimately, what stopped the Klan on a national level and really put them down was the FBI. And they, to the point now that it's none of the Klan groups, I don't know really the details on this, talk to Southern Poverty Law Center, they do, but it's like they can't connect all these different Klan groups together, because then it becomes some other level of criminality, criminal syndicalism, I don't know what the fuck they call it, but it's some kind of mafioso kind of stuff. So you got to give the FBI credit for ultimately kicking the Klan's ass. But back when we were fighting the Klan, the FBI was working with the cops against the Klan groups. Okay? So.
If you read books about like the 1930s in Houston, like the mayor was a member of the Klan, like the Klan.
Pappy Bond, the chief police, was rumored to be the head of the Klan in Texas. The police chief of Houston during the 1960s.
There's still scary people out there, but the Klan was the power structure in Houston. It was worse. Some things have gotten slightly better.
Well, there was a Klan recruiting poster on the wall in the dressing room of HPD for like 20 years. And reporters would, go to conference, the police chief would do a press conference and reporters would ask them about it. You can see this on the internet. Those articles are still there, the archives. And it's like asking their chief police, hey, what about that Klan recruiting poster, in the dressing room? And this is like a quote almost verbatim from the police chief. It's like, well, I don't see any contradictions, And true enough, it's like no contradictions there.
I think, we can look back at that now and kind of laugh at it. And I don't know if we can still laugh at it. It's really not terribly funny. because